Hello. Welcome to the Community Rituals podcast, hosted by Nynke and myself from the I Am We Are Collective. I'm Jamie Colston, and over the last few years, I've been playfully exploring how working together can create the best possible future for our children and their children. I'm a facilitator and a parent, and I love working with my friends.
And I'm Nynke. I am an origin designer, grief counselor, youth coach, and facilitator. I love working with young people, with nature, with rituals, and with grief. Happy to work together with Jamie. Different things that we will speak about today. Today we're joined by Evva. Would you like to share something about yourself?
I feel quite jealous of your beautifully succinct introductions. I work as a facilitator, a ritual artist, experienced designer, and a somatic practitioner. And really, my work is centered around pathways of belonging and remembering ourselves back to our bodies, back to each other, and to the wider web of life. My work is centered around healing the story of separation, and that tends to be the common thread. And I've been exploring grief quite deeply for over a year now, and it has informed a lot of the work that I'm doing today right now.
Thank you. That was a beautiful introduction as well, and we practiced before, so we were cheating. Could you tell us about what ritual means to you, and how it became part of your life and work and your practice?
Yeah, about it the other day, actually, because I know people have very different definitions of ritual, and I think in kind of common language, oftentimes people will talk about like having like coffee, let's say, being your morning ritual, and I think that's one aspect of thinking about rituals as maybe like moments of intention or something you do quite habitually that has a meaning to you. And for me, ritual, there's something about ritual that makes the invisible visible, or it speaks to the invisible, it speaks to the unseen, it acknowledges the existence of the unseen. I think I hope I'm right. I think it's Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass. She talks about, the ritual of smudging, and that the smoke is there to make our intentions visible to the spirits, to let them be known to the spirits. And for me, there is something about creating rituals that are very physical, like you create something when you're creating a ritual that is visible and it's felt, and it speaks to moments in life that are often, quite complex, and then there are a lot of elements that are unseen, that you can't really put a finger on it. And a ritual, I think, helps us to acknowledge that the huge part of our rounds as well, of our experience. And it gives it shape, and it gives it form. I came into ritual work, or ritual being part of my big life. I think when I think about growing up in Poland at the time that I did, that Poland is a very religious country, and even though my family wasn't particularly religious, the country is so religious that even if you're not religious, you just you're part of it. Religions, they're centered around rituals, so so ritual was always part of life, and not in a particularly kind of like romantic way. You know, it was quite it was so embedded into life that I don't think I ever thought of it as ritual at all. But now when I look back at my life, you know, doing things like even fasting at different times of the year, or creating little offerings that you take to the church, these specific ways of celebrating different moments, or even, you know, the way when I walk around my home city, Warsaw, you have shrines everywhere, and those shrines are tended to really beautifully. And I really love the kind of the juxtaposition of, you know, the busyness of Warsaw, which is a city I grew up in, and, you know, right next to a really bustling, busy market, you have a Mary shrine that it's there for people to kind of stop and tend to. So I think I've grown up with this, I guess, with the acknowledgement that there is a spiritual and an unseen realm that is there, and that there are rituals associated with being in relationship to that realm. Oh, I think actually, particularly one of my grandparents had that, you know, has always had a really close connection to nature, and again, not in a kind of like really romantic way. It just in so deeply embedded into his life that that it was just, you know, who he was. And I think that deeper relationship with nature has opened me up to the type of ritual that I am now in relationship with. In my adult life, I think I kind of to my own rituals that sort of serve me and the life I want to be contributing to, for a real need of support. I think, you know, as life goes on, often as we age, it gets more and more complex, and I think in the last few years particularly, I've just found myself really needing support. Like I just needed to feel like I am somehow held in a wider web of creation, and it was that longing for belonging to something bigger that has put me on a path of exploring what ritual might mean in my life today.
That's a beautiful answer to that question. I can think of a million things to ask, but I'm supposed to hand it over to Jamie.
I'm just wondering whether, Nynke, maybe you could ask the questions in the form of answers, like how would we answer this as well? And
that's a beauty. Yeah. So since the age of 22, 23, I've been working with kids, and I think kids are my big inspiration when it comes to ritual, because they just do it, and it's like such a big part of the way they move through life. And I worked, you know, within children's centers with various ages, and ritual was such a big part of that. The rhythms of the year, but also beginning and starting a day, becoming part of a group, leaving. There's so many transitional moments that in my work we would always give shape to, with attention and intention. So I think that has been my training as a ritual maker, let's say that. The last 9 or 10 years of that job, I did it for like 15. I worked with like 10 to 12-year-olds that would make the shift to high school, which is a really important transitional moment in the life of a kid, because, you know, everything changes. People go to different levels, so the group falls apart. They need to make new friends, and their whole system is, you know, in transition. And we would do like a really elaborate ritual for that at the end of summer before they would go to school. And then I just saw how important that was and how much rest, maybe, or understanding it gives to kids to know where they're at. You know, am I still in this form and shape, or am I something different? And what is that? And what is expected of me in that new shape? And after that, I started doing very different things, but still that was the biggest part of working with kids and youth that I felt that belonged to me and that I really wanted to do. And I just started training systemic work, rite of passage facilitating, and now brief work, which for me is also really connected to ritual. Yeah, I think that's my answer. That's how it's involved. And, you know, in my family life, it's always a part of it. My upbringing of my son. It's very embedded. I don't know where it comes from. Yeah, I think my grandfather that I never knew was a minister in the church, so maybe there's something there. And on the other side of my grandmother's side, I think they were very involved in nature because they were herb seekers for the liquor industry. So maybe somewhere in that through line something came through, and this is where I am now.
I was thinking about this today and trying to think about which point to note. I guess coming from a family where none of the things that I do now were part of growing up. You know, lighting candles, giving myself space for kind of being reflective on life and what it is, what my choices are, what do I want to do now, which I think is part of how I use ritual in my everyday life, but also in the work that I do. It's really a kind of way of making a conscious, intentional effort to live in a particular way, to act in a particular way. But I did think when you were talking, Nynke, about because I saw my mum recently and she was talking about she used to go to a Catholic school and was taught by nuns, and so there is that in my past as well, in my ancestral line. But I think actually it's much more for me something that I've come into contact with lots of different experiences, whether it's kind of following goddess rituals in my early 20s or Vipassana meditation practices in my mid-20s to more ecological and men's-based work in my late 20s, and then sort of finding my own ways with it now. And then introducing sort of ritual into my home and into my family settings and into the way that I cultivate community practices, the way that I run workshops, and I have my quiet little ritual corner, which some people notice and you're like, oh, you're the person that I'm going to talk to about that today. Yeah. And I have my room that I am in constant sort of intentional ritual practice with my plants that move and change position with the sunlight and over winter months and spring months and summer months. And my space at home where I kind of, just have my ancestors in a corner and just really gratefully remembering what they have passed on to me, which is this like amazing life that I've managed to create for myself, which is nothing like what theirs was. And I was thinking about my grandfather this morning in the changing room of the saunas, because there were a couple of other older men in their elder years, and I was thinking, yeah, he would have hated my pink hair. But also I think he would have loved it as well. You know, there was something in there that just reminded me of him this morning. Yeah, the next bit, which is around communal grieving. And both Evva and I live in Bath, which had a really big communal grief process happen over the weekend, which I was running a systemic constellations workshop, and we all stopped in the middle of a constellation to look out the window and to watch the procession go past. It was Code Red for Nature, which was a sort of Extinction Rebellion piece around the loss of nature. And so, Evva, and maybe for all of us, is just how is communal grief or the acts of grieving within the context of community alive for you right now?
Yeah, it feels very alive. Just, you describing, that event in Bath, or even I think just mentioning the words communal grieving, I can feel it, in my body. I can feel kind of rising in me. Sometimes there are days where like the word grief gets mentioned and I'm already feeling like things are coming up. I think or feel that communal grief, the space to connect with grief as an emotion. It's interesting because I think I spend most of my life thinking that grief is a period of mourning. Like when someone dies, you wear black for a little bit, and that's grief. My understanding of grief was so limited for so long. I think it was also, not just my intellectual understanding of it, but like my ability to feel into it was really shut down and limited. And last year, I've experienced pregnancy loss, which absolutely smacked me in the face with grief and expanding this idea of grief. Of course, and it still is a deeply personal grief, but I did not in my wildest dreams would ever expect that it would have opened up the doors to grief that is absolutely collective. I experienced the loss of that spirit baby the way that's how it felt for me, the way Mother Earth is experiencing the loss of all lives at the moment, of all the little children, human, more than human, that are not being born, that are struggling to be dying. And it has been, still is, such an opening to the realization that when we don't grieve collectively, nothing can change. Because we grief is this, I've experienced grief as this hugely powerful force, but only if you engage with it. Like quite early on after my pregnancy loss, I didn't quite have tools, or maybe I wasn't ready for them yet to emerge, to be with it. And that grief felt like, like really stagnant, heavy water, like just felt lifeless. It felt like a lifeless place that from nothing could be born. And then when I began to work with grief, in very intentional and I want to say actually like quite courageous, like I want to give that to myself, like courageous ways. Then I experienced grief as a river, like a really powerful force of nature, and it, and it's wild and it's untamed and it does what it wants to do, but it's definitely not a lifeless place. It's a place of full of life, like teeming with life. And when I think of the wider context of where we are, when I bring it back to the collective grief, for me, we live in a culture that actually, and when I say we live in a culture, I talk, I obviously talk just about my individual context that I'm connected to, in a culture that actually is not good at being in relationship with life. You know, we have ways of artificially kind of like keeping life going, but actually it's a culture that it's not very good at regenerating life and participating in that. And so for me, having experienced grief as this powerful force that actually propels you towards life when you work with it, I feel, I mean, excited is a sort of slightly weird maybe word to use in here, but I do feel excited about the potential of collective grieving for us to move towards creating cultures and worlds that understand the sanctity of life and are able to participate in regenerating life on Earth. And I feel like that without that grief piece, I just don't know how we could even begin to get there. And so that collective grief is really, like, even just speaking about it, I feel my whole body is lit up. And I feel this kind of energy current coursing through me. I'm really excited to, actually, I'm really curious to hear you answer those questions as well.
Thank you for that beautiful answer. There's a lot of things that I can sense into and that resonate. I think for me, when I think about this question, I feel the same thing, that my culture or the place where I'm living in right now has lost touch with the source of life that grief holds. And sometimes I feel like I'm amazed by how well we kind of keep that part out of the door, how we shy away from it, how we, tiptoe around it and, make endless ways into all kinds of other directions, while the essence of trying to, I don't know if saving is the right word, or finding the right way in this current state of the world is, for me, is grief. That point of surrendering to it, to feel it, to sense it, and to somehow process it into something new and alive. I can feel that too. And I'm trying to find ways of more collective experiences in that, and to somehow open that space for people by trying to find out where grief lives, by trying to put it on the map together with Jamie, how to work with it, and to get people to tap in to that space in order to kind of, I think when you're met in your grief by others and you're witnessed in it, it's such a healing power, and it makes me very humble when that happens. And I would love to design more spaces and ways to do that together with people.
Thanks. I've just jotted down a couple of notes, I think, as a sort of personal access point for me was, I think just as we came out of COVID and I started doing the first year of family constellations training, I sort of really came into this sort of deep contact with my own grief around the loss of love, and then my connection and a particular kind of relationship with somebody, that then kind of took me into this sense of how that is also an echo of relationships that have gone through time with many of my ancestors too, and this sort of sense, thankfully, because of my teachers, but also because I had a sort of communal practice of being in relationship with friends and telling what felt often like the same story over and over and over again, but I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad that I had friends who were able to sit with me with it, because over the year and 2 years and 3 years, that story changed. And I think it changed because I didn't try and run away from the grief or try and alter my experience to it. And what happened, because I was doing the constellations training, was that I just kind of got deeper and deeper into this sense of looking backwards to where kind of almost like collective grief within the context of our ancestors comes through us. And so it's one of the things that I notice in constellations work now, is this sort of senses, because it is, for me anyway, it's communal work. It's, there are lots of people doing it one-to-one, but for me, it's a communal practice of coming together and sort of being with our ancestral stories and seeing how, for me, what I experienced was always having this sense in my throat and my chest, this sort of grief that sometimes I could experience, and many other times I would just shut it down. Like I would, do things that would keep that energy suppressed. And over the last few years, I've kind of got rid of those habits of suppression. And so I'm more in my body, and the more space I've allowed that to be and to process itself out of my body has meant that I'm also more available to do that with other people as well. And so that kind of flow that you were talking about, Evva, of the sort of the rivers, I've really experienced that in a sort of embodied way in my own body. And for me, like, the benefit of collective grieving is that we can see that it is something that we all share, like it's common to all of us. I was listening to the podcast with Krista Tippett and Nick Cave, and that was one of the things that they talked about, is this sense of sort of, that it is the thing that we all share. We all have things to grieve, but what we've lost is our rituals, the people who help us do that, the people who can articulate it beyond death, and into all of the sort of the micro things that we grieve every single day without noticing it, because our lives are too fast. And it's not that we have to kind of sort of wallow in it or like get stuck in it. It's just that we need to be able to allow ourselves to feel it and feel it together, so that and to acknowledge it as part of our living. And somehow that acknowledgement and allowing gives us more life force.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jamie. I do have a question. Shall I fire away? I'd love to know or to hear how these collective grieving spaces take shape for you. What do they look like, feel like, sense like?
That question immediately makes me kind of think of, in some ways, the broader context of like, what are the rituals for these times? And for me, that always involves an element of remembering, like remembering something old and ancient that maybe we once did, our ancestors once did, and like reimagining for these times, for the future, for this context. For a lot of us these days, the idea of like reclaiming rituals and that includes collective grieving spaces, it kind of means like making up as we go along, like really trusting that there's something much deeper running through us that can guide us into it. Because it's not like I've grown up with a sense of what a collective grieving ritual looks like. I did not at all. In my context, children would actually, like, we wouldn't go to funerals because like I remember specifically my parents wouldn't take us to funerals because that's like bleak and not very, that was deemed that it's kind of not appropriate for children, too sad, I suppose, for children to attend to. So I don't even remember attending something so I guess like elemental when it comes to grief, I suppose, as a funeral. So I never had or I don't have a book or even an oral tradition of like, what do you do? And yet I know that when I'm in an intentional space where grief is kind of invited, things really emerge, and somehow I and people that I'm with, we find ourselves being guided into a space, into a ritual. So like, I know there's clearly something in our bones that responds to it, that guides us. Come back to your questions, like how do they take shape? There's a part of my brain that is thinking of like the kind of the practicals. How do they actually look like, and what are the components of it? And then there's other part of me that thinks of how do they feel, or what the intentions behind them is. Me, there is something about collective grief spaces that, it's almost like it's a bit of a game of, or not a game, but like, well, I suppose, yeah, I can say game, like a game of like pushing on a few doors and seeing which door becomes an opening, right? And like music can be an opening, movement can be an opening, meditation can be an opening, other people crying, like what, or making like audible sounds and shows of their grief. Because I've often felt that like my grief was suppressed, and I was like, I really wanted it to come out, but I somehow couldn't, like, and I really know that experience very, very well, of like things are rising to the surface, but somehow there is a block, and it doesn't feel safe, or it doesn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't come out. So for me, a collective grieving space contains different elements that can potentially be an opening, is held in a way that somehow lets us know it is safe for it to be known here. I sometimes like even sort of slightly struggle with the way released, because it is released in some ways, but I'm always really cautious to kind of like, I don't know, not to go into the sphere of some kind of, that we work through grief, that like we release it and then it's healed, it's transformed, it's done, we've released it, and poof, it's gone. Like, that's, to me, that's not the work. For me, collective grieving spaces are about to actually be in touch with the grief, like have a conversation with her, or safe enough to move with it, like dance with it. That's when, for me, something really interesting has the potential to happen. That's when that potential for that aliveness that we spoke about, because it is really interesting. I often talk to people about grief, and the response I met with is often kind of like, that's doom and gloom, or that's not very, you don't really want to spend your life in that kind of state. And it's like, yeah, of course you don't want to spend your life in a constant sort of really deep engagement with grief, because that's that can be exhausting. But I just never experienced it as life draining. I've experienced it as the complete opposite. And when we can hold that space for one another collectively, I mean, what a beautiful thing to receive. Like, what a beautiful thing to then hold in ourselves, that like together we can hold so much, and we don't need necessarily specific qualifications. And what I mean by that, this isn't to say that people who are obviously qualified in this work and have been doing it, like, that's beautiful. But I guess what I mean by that is that in collective grief spaces, we can experience of connection that holds so much. And you know, for me, it's like regaining trust in ourselves as collective, that actually, like, yeah, we can hold things, very difficult things, and constantly always have to outsource it to something or someone else that we, and maybe I feel like I've meandered quite a lot, so I feel some kind of obligation to return to your original question of, like, how do they take shape, right? They take for me, they take shape in nature, or at least with, like, where we can access being with the wider web of creation. They take shape through sounds and song and music, take shape through in intentional contact with the unseen realm. That's a good place to pause.
Thanks. It made me think of so Nynke and I both have this very close to us, which is this little booklet called The Grieving Imperative, Countering Grievance Now and Together, by somebody who we've met through this sort of inquiry process called Jethro Heiko. And I think in terms of your question, and also partly a response to Evva's words, is this sense of that these conversations are also part of a collective grieving process, and a way of kind of coming into contact with describing and naming and like expanding what we mean by grief and grieving. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is what I see in communities through WhatsApp group, Facebook's groups, like coming into contact with people, is that there are a lot of angry people at the moment who are angry about really specific things that you wouldn't think that would cause so much rage. And I think part of that is because one, I don't think people have really grieved what happened during COVID times for many people. I don't think there's been any language or space for talking about that. And I think I wrote down one thing, which is just, I miss you. And how simple saying that, how that simple sort of saying can just, I was saying it as Evva was speaking. I was just thinking, yeah, like, there's been times where I've just said that rather than responding with more words that take me away from the experience of what I really want to say, which is just like, I fucking miss you. And so I think there's something that is really collective in that. There's a sort of collective missing each other, a missing of each other. And so I hope part of these conversations will illuminate some of that. And lastly, for me, poems is my way of and practice of sort of illuminating some of the ways in which I can put words to all of the different conversations that I've heard over a period of time and turn it into something that is a form that everybody, like, people don't know that they've kind of been part of that poem, but they are. And so when I read those poems back to people, they can feel the collective nature of them and how they speak to something that, we might have shared together or that has been shared in a wider community. Thanks. Really good question.
I'll answer it myself a bit too. There was something in what you shared, Evva, that I wrote down. A place where it's safe to be known. For me, working with grief is not about solving it, never, because that is our first, reaction usually. It has to be solved. And in this work, one of the most important movements for me inside myself is just it doesn't need to be solved, but we need to get better at being with it. And that's what I want to do. And in that, the grief I sense, and especially about the state of the world and nature, is so big that I'll never be able to sit with it by myself ever. And that we humans have this amazing ability to do that together, and to somehow, by intention and ritual, and I think ritual is a very important part of that, to kind of weave a big heart, or like a, a collective heart to carry grief, or to be with grief, or to hold us in that grief. And that is, for me, that is also kind of the way forward in all of this mess, to create ways to do that. And for me, it takes shape in connecting and conversations, in dance. And I think these are ways in, like the doors you spoke about, and they're ways into not dissolving, but to be in relationship with it. If I call out, if you sing together, you create that collective heart to be able to be with. And in that process, it will maybe change shape, and at least it's known to everyone.
Just before we sort of head towards sort of checking out, and just wanting to really acknowledge the sort of many metaphors related to water that we've spoken of today, and just kind of the last thing that I've taken in my notes is this sense that grief isn't a puzzle to be solved. It's a river to follow the flow of, a wave to surf, an ocean to swim.
Are there any wishes you have? When you think about grief and collective grief and ritual.
When you first said the word wish, I was like, oh, that's such a beautiful kind of dreamy thing. And I immediately went to like, my wish is for someone to fund this work. Very practical, very practical wish. Yeah, to be fair, it's like, it's both, there are some beautiful wild dreams and wishes that I hold. But I think actually my immediate, like, oh gosh, I really wish this work was more funded, it also speaks to the wish for grief to be recognized as a vital part of our lives. It deserves, or demands in many ways, real reverence. So I think, we live in a financial economic paradigm. So in some ways, I think my wish for this work to be funded is a wish for reverence for grief. In some ways, I think my wish is also, to like return and reimagine loss. Like, loss is just a part of the deal, it just is. And it does not help when we kick the can down the road, or we sweep things under the carpet and we say, oh, we can deal with loss much later, when someone dies, or when I'm on my deathbed, or whatever. I just don't think it doesn't make us live fully as we could be. It doesn't make us live lives in reciprocity, it doesn't make us participate in not just our own lives, but just life as a whole. Wish is really, when I kind of imagine the wild futures that future generations of humans and more than humans will get to experience in my dreams. It's, these futures contain that seed of just remembering that life is, it's mad that we're alive. It's mad that we are alive. And it's mad that there is this place called Earth on which we have everything for life to thrive if we're in the right relationship with it. And yeah, it wants our reverence. It wants our reverence. Yeah, so fund this work and return to reverence and acknowledging that loss is part of life. These are my little wishes.
Very beautiful wishes. I wish it with you, the funding and and the reverence and inviting it. Yeah, and making it part of the whole.
I echo what you said. I don't think I can say it more beautifully than that. I kind of put it into a little paragraph of a poem that I'll write later, but funding the reverence of our lives, the reciprocity of our stories, reimagining what we hope for, remembering who we are and how utterly mad it is that we are alive right now. Yeah. I'm done. Thank you so much.
We appreciate really appreciated this time that we shared, and appreciate both of your commitment and your work to ritual and grief. Mad way to spend the Monday morning.
Yeah, great way to spend the Monday morning. Thank you for sharing everything you shared. It was really beautiful to listen to you, to hear you put into words a lot of what I sense and believe in a new way. So that's really good.
Thanks, Evva. I'm just thinking, do you want to just say a little bit about some of the amazing things that you're involved in, like the circus stuff, becoming crew, like there are so many utterly brilliant things that you do. And maybe you might just want to say a little bit about that before.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's, I appreciate the invitation. So my work spans across a few different initiatives and projects that I'm co-creating with some wonderful people, not just people. And becoming crew is a big part of it. And becoming crew, I think the best way I can describe it, it's an unlearning platform. So we host experiences center that question: how might we compost and reimagine the story of separation? So really acknowledging that the way out of the mess that we are in, or even begin to move out of the mess, is to get into the right relationship with life, with our bodies, with one another, with the wider web of life. And we do that through online gatherings. And in September, we're also launching a fairly new offering. We've been practicing it for a while, but yeah, we're opening it up to people who are interested in it. It's these are weekend nature solos, so it's our time to be in deep connection with the wider web of life. Spend some time in solitude, but not alone. Sleeping under the stars on a beautiful piece of land near Glastonbury, and really begin to develop the tools and an understanding that all the insights, all the guidance that we ever need in life is here. It is out there, and it's contained in this vast intelligence of life that we are part of, but maybe we don't always have so much connection or relationship with. So it's an invitation actually to bring questions and tensions as well onto the land, and listen deeply to what it has to say to you, and meet your edges. It's for a lot of people, for most of us, sleeping in the dark in the woods, it's really edgy, but that wild edge offers an awful lot of insight and guidance. So that's becoming crew. I'm also part of a crew that puts together earth rituals, and with Of the Wild Collective, which is a beautiful collective of circus artists and performers. And really the work there is about returning ritual to its roots, or performance, sorry, to its roots in rituals. Like performance was always about co-creating something with, so the lines between performers and audience, you know, they have become really strict these days, but really whenever we're coming to watch someone perform, we're also taking part in co-creating that ritual. Move around the wheel of the year, so celebrating the big seasonal shifts that happen, that we're part of, that we're affected by through arts and creativity, which feels so deeply needed for these times. Like our ability to be together, express our creativity, express our emotions, whatever it is that is coming up, and remind ourselves that yes, you know, we're governed by social, financial structures, political structures, sure, but there are much more enduring structures and patterns and rhythms that are the rhythms of the earth. Yeah, maybe that's enough about my work.
Thanks. So maybe just to say thank you to anyone who is listening. You'll see in the podcast description links to all of our work, whether they're sort of collective pieces or individual pieces, and so you can find out more about us there.
Thank
you
you
so much.